Good to go?
Yeah, hi everybody. This is Diana Gray, and we're recording today's session on RPA design and development. Today we have Mason Turvey with us and Tracy Dixon, and I'll let them introduce themselves.
Hey everyone, I'm Mason Turvey. I'm a UiPath MVP. I've been working with UiPath in various businesses for around 3 years now. Going to do this session on arguments and variables today.
Yeah, and I am helping out Mason also at UiPath MVP. Started learning RPA in late 2018, focused on UiPath then and have been primarily ever since. So I'll be adding color commentary here and there, but Mason will be the primary speaker today on variables.
Yep. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into it. So this is on variables and arguments. So what we're going to cover is variables and the different types that they can have. We'll cover the variables panel, and I'm also going to pull in the data manager panel with that, and then going to talk about the scope of a variable, arguments, the arguments panel, argument directions, and then arguments versus variables and what the difference between those two are. Um, some of the learning objectives are to be able to define the variables and explain their types, explain what the variables panel is and how to use that and the data manager panel, explaining the scope of variable arguments and the arguments panel as well. And then describe and use argument directions, compare the arguments and variables. So variables and their types. We're going to give a quick introduction to variables, the properties of variables, some of the best practices for naming variables, and the types of variables in Studio. So quick introduction to variables. Variables are containers, and they're used to store types of data. They make it easy to label and store data to be used throughout the automation process. They are scoped within a workflow. So they can only be accessed within that workflow, and they are scoped based on the container that they're in. So that's basically where you would use a variable within the lifespan of one workflow. A variable will have an initial value that can change during the program through an external input. You can change that using an assign or different activities. And it's like a box that stores data, right? So the variable can store different data types, and it's going to be the main thing that is storing data throughout your UiPath program. You can configure variables through their properties. So you can give it a name, a type, a value, and a scope. So the name is obviously the name of the variable. The type is the data that's going to be stored in there. So you can use any C# object type that you have pulled in through your NuGet packages. For a value, you can hold any of the data that that type would hold. And then for scope, that is specifically where that variable lives in the program, and we'll dig into that one a little bit more in Studio. Some of the best practices for naming variables. One of my biggest tips for naming variables, and this goes for all programming languages, not just UiPath, is use as many words as you need to be descriptive. A variable's length is, don't keep variables short. Don't use abbreviations. Don't use acronyms or anything in your variable if you can get away from them. Try to keep them as long as they need to be descriptive and specific. You want to be very clear and meaningful about those names and very intentional. That way you can keep track of them. You can assign your names in a consistent manner, making sure that things are the same. Maybe you have certain types of variables that you use for certain operations. So you just, use an underscore tag with that variable to make sure that you keep those ones organized. It's best to use camel case to name your variables. So with camel case, we're going to keep the, what I typically do is I use camel case, like the first letters capitalized of each word. I've seen some people use Pascal case where the first letter of the first word is not capitalized and then the first letter of all the other words are capitalized. In C#, we typically do that for private variables and then use camel case for the public variables. And something that I have my developers do sometimes in Studio is the same thing. If it's scoped to the main workflow, using camel case, and if it's scoped within a subset of the workflow, using Pascal case, but it's typically just use camel case for all of your variables. And then Keep your names descriptive, yet short. I kind of don't agree with that one. Long variable names are okay. Don't like make a paragraph, but longer variable names are okay because you have IntelliSense that you can use to autofill your variable names. Different types of variables in Studio. So we have, these are the main types, but you can use any C# type. So we've got strings, Boolean, number, date and time, data table, queue item, and array. Queue item is
And really
specific.
any C# or VB.NET type, since I think
Yeah.
probably the default for most folks will be VB.NET.
Yeah. So these are all pretty straightforward except for queue item. Queue item is a specific UiPath type, and we'll get into how that one works a little bit more. So for string variables, they store a sequence of text. So any word, they're declared with double quotations, and you can reuse that text through the code and modify it. So an example, the variable name might be comp name. See, this is what I would call a not descriptive variable name. You can just put company name, right? And that's what I would put for that variable to make it more descriptive, with value XYZ Corp. So this would be the value, and you can see that it's in the double quotations there. For Boolean variables, they hold two values, true or false. You can think of that as like 0 or 1, on or off, true, false. They're used with control statements to help determine the flow of a program. They are also a type that are used just to evaluate statements for truth or false in various parts. So thinking about this from a business logic standpoint, is this item available in the invoice? True when the item is available, false when the item is unavailable. The naming conventions on your Boolean variables is important so that you know what the true represents and what the false represents. So if you start your Boolean variable with like does exist or exists, right? And think of it as like a question. True means yes, false means no to that question. So a lot of times you'll be identifying, in UiPath specifically, you'll want to see if there's a specific element on the screen, right? Say control exists. So true means that it does, false means that it doesn't. And so your naming on your Boolean variables is very important there so that you can keep track of what's going on in your control flow. For number variables, they store numeric values, can execute equations, perform comparisons, and pass important data. An example is item quantity. Again, item quant, but you can just spell out item quantity. It's good to keep those verbose. With a value of 50, there are different number types. There's integers, int32, there are long integers, there are double where you can put decimal places, bytes, which can only store up to like 255. Basically, any of the number types that you can use in C# can also be used here. The most common one that you'll see is an integer type. So that would be like this 50, nothing with a decimal. It can store, I think, up to 32 bits of information in it. So it can store quite a bit. Date and time variables. So this one is specifically in C# called the date time variable. So when we'll see that when we go into the panel. You store information about date and time. They can be used to calculate number of days between two dates, store the current date, details about dates. Another example on this one, invoice date. Again, not a super descriptive name because invoice is abbreviated, but we have a value of 01/01/2020. One thing with date time is that it's always going to store the time with it. There's a date type as well, but we typically use the date time type even if we're not using the time with it. Data table variables. So this is, think of this like an Excel data table. It's going to have rows and columns and hold larger pieces of data and act as a database. You can use this to migrate data from a database to another, extract information from a website, or if you're looking at a spreadsheet, like an Excel spreadsheet, you can read that into a data table. So let's say listing all the items in an invoice, variable name might be, and here's where we use a very specific naming convention, DT underscore invoice item. So we put DT underscore to represent that as the data table. And then typically when you're naming a data table, you go with what one row would represent. So in this case, this data table is all of the invoice items, but one row is an invoice item. So this is data table of invoice items, right? But we keep this singular instead of plural because it's one invoice item per row. And it has values like item 1, item 2, item 3. Each of those values is going to be a row that has different fields within it. Okay, so the queue item variable, this is particular to UiPath. When we're working with queues in Orchestrator, a queue item becomes relevant. This is like a work item that UiPath will be working on. It's used to input extracted items in other processes. So let's say you have a process that is working invoices one at a time. It'll pull them from the queue one at a time, and each queue might represent one specific invoice. That's a good example of that. The queue holds different things like specific data, output, and analytics, and there's different fields within that queue item that can be used. There's also a reference to kind of name the queue item, and different things that the queue item stores, and we'll see those as well. For arrays, so an array is a collection that stores multiple elements of the same data type. Arrays are fixed in size, so they can't really be added to. They're used to organize that data so that you know that they're a related set. So let's say we have a list of company names, right? You could have a list of strings, or an array of strings specifically. And it could be, the variable name could be array company name, or you could just say company names, right? And it's an array. And then you can see this declaration here. We have a left curly brace, ABC, XYZ, right curly brace, right? And it's separated by a comma there. These two types in here are strings. And then with the curly braces, we know that that is an array type. All right, so an array versus a string. One little thing about strings is that strings are arrays of characters, but they're handled special in C#. So an array is a sequential collection of elements similar data types, and a string is a sequence of single characters represented as a single data type, right? So the string is one data type by itself on top of the characters that make it up. An array, the elements are stored contiguously in increasing memory locations. Strings can be stored in any manner in memory locations. There's a specific implementation on the back end for strings. An array is a special variable that can hold more than one value at a time. And strings can only hold character data. So an array could be like an array of numbers, you could have an array of data tables, basically any type. You can have an array of arrays if you want. So an array can hold any type of data that you can assign to a variable. And an array's length is predefined, whereas a string's length is not predefined. And there are other collections other than arrays. So you have things like lists and dictionaries that are pretty common. And those are not predefined in length, and they have different ways of interacting with them. But arrays are always going to be predefined, right? They're always going to have one consistent length. You're never going to add or subtract from those. All right, so let's talk about the variables panel. And I'm actually going to pull up Studio for this one. So I'm just going to start a new process, call it demo. We'll choose the Windows compatibility. We will go with VB for this one. All right, so we're here in our main sequence. Zoom in a little bit. Can you guys all see all the text and everything? I'm on a 4K
I'd
screen,
probably
so it
make
might
it,
be.
I'd make it a little bit bigger.
Okay. See, there's not an easy way to zoom in.
Oh yeah, that little thing there. You can type in whatever number you want, by the way. If those don't work, that's
Yeah,
better.
it's mainly the variables are still going to be small.
Yeah.
Let me stop sharing and start sharing my top screen. That might be a little bit easier on the eyes. There, how's that?
Much better.
Yeah, feels better to me.
All right. So we've got our main sequence here. What we're going to look at is this tray down here. This is called the variables tray. And this is where variables can be defined in your workflow. So we're going to select an activity. We're going to set this main sequence. So that's going to be our scope. You can create a variable here. I'm going to create just a data table variable. Call it dt underscore table. And you can see the variable type right here in this column where you can select your data type. I'm going to select that data table. We've got the scope. Right now we just have the main sequence. And then we can give it a default. So I could say new data table here, right? To declare that. So this default is, you can use this to initialize, you could use it to set a value, right? So if we had like a count variable, give it the type int32, right? That's our number type that doesn't have decimals. Could say 50, right? So we're initializing that to 50. One thing about certain variables like the int32, date time, Boolean, is that they have an auto initialize. So if I was to create, let's say count2, and give it int32, and I don't give it a default, it's going to default to 0. And then same thing for, let's give it just a bool. Oh, I can't name something Boolean. Exists. Give this Boolean, right? I can only give it false or true here, right? Those are the, you can see I misspelled true there. So I can give it that default, but if I don't give it a default, it's going to initialize into false because these cannot store null. Whereas with our data table, because this is a complex data type, it's going to default to null. It's like if I typed null in here, or nothing in VB.NET. Whereas for int32s, our booleans, they can't do that. Strings can be nothing as well, so they'll initialize to nothing. So we talked about scope of variables. So that is where the variable exists. So if I was to pull in an assign here, right? Assign is where you work with your variables most of the time. So if I was to say I want to increment count, so I'm setting count, I'm saving to the variable count, value to save is count plus 1. So I'm doing that in the main sequence here. If I was to drop in another sequence, and then an assign in there, I can access count in here as well. And I can increment that as well. I'm going to name this nested sequence. All right. So what happens when I set count to my nested sequence? Now I can change the scope here, right? That means that it's now only accessible within this sequence. And you'll see now I have validation errors out here. When I click on an activity, and I have my variables open, if I click on an activity out here in main sequence, you'll see count goes away. It doesn't even show up. If I click over here, it shows up again. So that is what scoping your variable means. You can scope it to specific activities. And there are many places where you can scope things, and where scope really becomes relevant in things like loops. So if I have like a for each, just like a for each loop, you'll notice that this comes with a sequence. If I was to use an array type, let's create an array real quick. We're going to create an array of strings. All right, it's going to be me and Tracy here. And if I put names, see, I created that in the scope body. I need to set the scope to main sequence because it's not available in my main sequence. See how it disappears there? So we're going to set to main sequence, and then I can access it here. And now inside of this body, I have the specific names the current items inside of that. So there are some activities that have like a scoped sequence inside of them, right? Um, for each while loops, your use browsers have those inside of them. Pretty much anything that has a container within it will also make use of this scope. So that's an overview of like the variables panel, how to declare variables, a little bit on how to use them in context.
To add one thing on that, I think it's definitely one of the hot spots for things to go wrong and for it to be a more troublesome bug to have, because whenever you add variables, if you're in the middle of a procedure, it may well not add it where the whole procedure can see, and it typically defaults to not do that. So you won't see it. You will move to even the next activity or two. You won't see it anymore, think that you've not done it. There's some good checks that you can run to see all of that. I personally tend, unless there's a reason not to, at least have the variable there visible for the procedure to avoid the troubleshooting problems with that. But there are a couple of workflow analysis things that I'll call out whenever you're overriding variables. You could be assigning them in two different places in the same procedure, which can be honestly very confusing. Wouldn't recommend doing that, but those can be really troublesome bugs to find, because you can also have arguments name the same thing. So it's important to just try to keep with naming conventions on that also, so you can distinguish those. But it can definitely be tough to find something whenever there's places you can't see it, which is the case here.
Yep. All right, so that's the variables tray, this panel down here. That is kind of the old way of doing things in UiPath, but that is the main way that you'll see developers using variables. There's a new way, and if we go over here, this is available, I think, hold me honest, Tracy, I'm not sure. I think it's from 23.4 when you have the data manager, right? Is that right?
Something like that. Yeah, you still don't see very many people use it, but it has been around for a while. And you do have flexibility on what you want to show there with the filter.
Yeah, so I'm gonna pop over to the data manager, and there's a lot more than just variables here, but we're only gonna focus on the variables for right now. The data manager is a cleaner interface for organizing these things. You'll see inside of this, I can add a new variable in this variables dropdown, and then I have my sequence, my main sequence. I can also set the scope of variables, the data types, their default values by dropping these down. I can change the name by double clicking here. So it's like a cleaner way to look at your variables. One thing that's really neat is when I set my scope, you actually have like a nested. So I could set my nested sequence, I could set my for each. It kind of recognizes the flow of your workflow and lets you set that there. So like we had earlier where count was inside of our nested sequence, I just set it there again. And so now I can drop down nested sequence, I can see count in there. And this might give you a little bit more clarity where your variables are, because you'll notice when you're looking at the variables tray, right, count doesn't show up. So I wouldn't intuitively know why this is happening here until I click into nested sequence and see count. But if I go over here, I have a more holistic view of things. I can drop down and see where all my variables are happening. So it's a little bit of a cleaner way to look at it. I kind of prefer to use the data manager these days, just because it's a little bit cleaner. We also talked about different types of variables. I'm going to use I'm just going to create a variable called special type. And then I'm going to use the data manager for this. So I can set, these are the main types that I have access to, right? There's a string array, because we declared a string array earlier. We've got array of type, Boolean, int, string, object, data table. I can also browse for types. So I can select a different type, and you can see all of the packages that I have in NuGet are in here. So I kind of have to know what I'm looking for here. I'm going to look for a datetime type, and you'll see it filters down to anything that starts with datetime. And then this one that's highlighted is my system.datetime. So I could put a default value of datetime.now in there, right? That's like today with the current time. I can also use, one cool thing about this is once you select a data type, it's going to be available for you in this list. So you won't have to browse for the type again. It'll show up right here. We can also look at the queue item type, right? This is specific to UiPath. I'm not going to get into any of the queue item activities that interact with this, but I will show you. You can create a new queue item with just the keyword new and then queue item. Right? And pretty much any variable type that you want to use, you can use this kind of declaration scheme with it. You can do this here in the defaults, and it'll show up down here. Or you can do that in an assign. So if I was to say my special type is a new queue item, I can put that in an assign to. This is called initializing the variable. So there's no data in there. It's just setting it to a new instance of that, because this is how classes and instances work in C#. If you think in C# you would have like var data name or variable name equals new whatever the type is with this. This is kind of setting it like you would in C#, or in VB. I think it uses the same syntax. It's been a while since I programmed in lines of VB. But that is the variables panel. All right, I'm gonna change the screen I'm sharing back down to the presentation. Let's see. All right, got that back up. All right, so we've gone through all of these steps. This will be in the presentation as well, about using the variables tray. So managing variables, we can create, modify, and initialize, right? So we showed all of that, how we initialize those, how we create them, how we modify them. So kind of an exercise that you can do on your own is, demonstrate the steps to create variables using the variables panel, the designer panel, and the properties panel. We didn't show the properties panel, so I'm going to pull this back up and show you guys the properties panel. There's one more panel in here. This is the properties panel, and so this is properties of a specific activity. So we have this assign activity. You can see we have the set value and the to value, and those correspond. So if I was to delete this, hit enter, right? That corresponds to this. I'm going to Control Z that back. All right, so that's what the properties panel is. There's a special way you can create variables. So let's say I wanted a new string variable, and I didn't want to go to my variables tab and create that variable because I just don't feel like it. I can hit Control K here, and I could say name, right? So there, that creates it. It creates it in the scope of this activity. So now we've got a name in the main sequence, and it's always going to be a string type. And then you can go in and change the type later. So I can set the name to Mason, right? There we go.
And then almost universally, there's multiple ways to do things. You can also right click and do create variable, and it will do the same thing for you as you're typing in the name. It will create that for you. If you don't do that, you're going to instantly have an error because you'll be referencing a variable that doesn't get it created at all.
Yeah, and if you want a quick, just like Tracy said, if you right click, I didn't know about this right click, so I'm learning something today. So if you right click, you can create a variable, and it actually shows you the key bindings for the hotkeys. So Control K is create a variable. When we get into arguments, you'll see that there's create in arguments. I didn't know this one for creating out arguments existed, so that's awesome. You can use that.
And it types them. So if you have a particular activity that outputs a specific kind of thing, you don't have to go look it up if you do it that way. It'll automatically put it in the type that should
Yeah,
be.
let's show that real fast. I'm going to. So the way that we get a queue item from a queue is this get transaction item activity. And you'll see, I'm just going to give it a test queue Q name. Okay, that doesn't need to be a string. There we go. And you'll see in here in the output in the properties panel, I have a transaction item type. If I hover over this, this is an out argument of type Q item. So that means my type is going to be Q item. If I control K here to create a variable, and I say transaction item, and then I go down here, see transaction item was created, and the type is UiPath.core.Q item. So we have our Q item type in there. And then this get transaction item is actually going to initialize that and store it in that variable. So we don't have to set a default or anything. A lot of the special types that you use, like Q item, data table, you'll never have to really initialize those, like we did with the new keyword. There will be an activity that you use that outputs those into the variable or argument. All right. So I think that's about it on variables.
I will add that once in a while, it took me a while to figure some things out regarding the names of things. I think we're used to seeing just the last name whenever it comes to, like we talked about, UiPath.core, blah, 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 whatever it is. A lot of times you'll just see that last piece of information referenced and think of that as the variable type. It's not prevented. You can have a couple of different things that also use that name. So sometimes it could be tough to figure out the right one. If you have an activity that uses that particular type, that's one way to go find it. If you didn't know everything before Q item was UiPath.core. Whatever, that could be one way to find something whenever you have things at lists, for example. I think there are multiple different kinds of lists. So if you just have the word list, it may get confused depending on what your dependencies are about which of the lists you want. So that could be helpful. And then also getting in behind and going and looking at the details of the variable types with the full namespace can be helpful to try to dig down into which one you wanted.
Yeah. So yeah, you'll notice if I try to use like certain words, there are the ones that you absolutely cannot use will come up with this. So I can't create a variable called new. Like we tried earlier, I can't create one called Boolean, right? But I can create one called Q item, right? There's nothing wrong with that. So it's a little bit ambiguous between the type and the variable name. You try to avoid creating variable names that are the same as the types that you're using, because when you're in here like typing these things in, are you using the variable or are you intending to use the type? It's smart enough to figure it out, right? Which one you're trying to use, because there's a specific syntax for using a type and there's a specific syntax for using variable, but you might do something that you're not intending to do, right? And that's where it can get dicey. All right, share my bottom screen again. Let's get back into this. All right, so that classroom exercise, the variables panel, the designer panel, and the properties panel. So that designer panel is the main window. That's the center one where we were doing all the work. The properties panel over there to the right. That is also where the data manager is. So you'll see those two kind of side by side. You can click on the tabs to get to both of those. And then the variables panel is down there in the bottom of the designer panel. So just get familiar with using all three of those in tandem those are the main places where you're doing all of the work in UiPath when you're working within a workflow and you're developing. So we talked about the scope. When it's declared in a specific activity, it's available only for the scope of that activity. There's the scope drop down, and then there's the scopes inside the data manager that you can use to set those. So again, important, if it's available inside the parent activity, so if it's like the main scope sequence, it's going to be available in all of the ones inside of that, but that is not true vice versa. There's one more type of variable that this presentation doesn't cover. It's kind of out of scope, but there's a type of variable called a global variable, and that is a variable that will be accessible anywhere in your project. not just inside of the workflow. I haven't seen those used a whole lot, but that is something that to be aware of that you can use. And you can declare those in the data manager panel. All right. So that was variables. Now we're going to get into arguments. And a lot of people get these two things confused at the start. It's like, why do we have arguments and variables? What's the difference between the two? I would think about arguments as input and output to a function, and treat your workflows as functions. So if you're used to creating functions in C# or C++, you have your arguments in kind of your declaration of the function itself, right? That's kind of the same thing in UiPath. We have arguments for a workflow, and then we can invoke that workflow and set the arguments input and output there. So an introduction to arguments, they're used to pass data from one workflow to another. They're going to enable users to reuse our workflows, store data dynamically, and they're useful specifically in projects that have multiple workflows. And I encourage using as many workflows as you can to try to separate out your logic into piecewise steps so that you don't create what I like to call sequence only RPA projects. So you just have like one really long sequence that does everything. That's great, but it can only do one thing, right? Whereas if you're creating different workflows, you get to reuse your code. You can use it in multiple places, and it challenges you to think a little bit more in a more reusable fashion. So using workflows in this way, and I'll show you how to create workflows and everything, but using workflows in this way is better for reusability of your code.
And that's a fundamental RPA concept. You always want to be building something with the idea of potentially reusing it in mind, because it really doesn't make sense to build the same thing over and over again. It makes sense to use something repeatedly if you can. So that reuse concept is really important, and one that'll be important to think about throughout.
Yeah, a good rule of thumb is anytime you find yourself copying and pasting like a large sequence or a lot of activities from one place to another, they probably should be a workflow. That's what I tell my developers. If you're copying and pasting large pieces of code, then just make it into a workflow and reuse it. So some properties of arguments. You'll notice these are very similar to what we had for variables. We have names, so we have the name of the argument. We have the direction, that's new. So this is in, out, or in, out. So those are the three directions that we can have for an argument. There's a fourth one on there that I've never used. We'll look at it, but we're not going to use that one. It's called property, I believe. And then we will look at types, same as like variable types. Arguments have the same kind of types. And then we have values, the data that the argument holds. All right, so let's switch back over to Studio again so we can see workflow arguments. All right, so we have my main workflow here. I'm going to go ahead and clear this out and just give us a blank slate to start with. And I am going to create a new workflow. So that's over here in this project tab. I have my studio set up a little bit unique, where my project tab is down here separate from my activities tab. For you, it might look like this, where the project tab is like right here and your activities tab is here. So if you need to find your project tab, it's going to be over to the left, and it's going to be under one of these tabs. I like to set it up this way just so I can always see it. I'm going to add a sequence. Any of these is a workflow, right? So we've got a sequence, we've got a flowchart, we've got a state machine. A form isn't a workflow, but a workflow is quite literally a workflow. And then we've got the coded types and global handler down there. We can add files and folders, but I'm going to add a sequence. That's going to be just like this sequence here. It is a sequence activity. The flowchart activity is the flowchart activity. State machine is a state machine activity. If we add a workflow, it's the same thing as adding a sequence. There's not really a difference between those two. And I'm just going to call this my nested workflow. So when you're naming workflows, you can put spaces. You can put dashes. You can put special characters in there. I like to name my workflows and make them kind of clean, so I always put spaces. Not a lot of people like to do that. That's just a Mason thing. And then it'll always insert this little underscore there. Okay, so now I have this new workflow, right? This is my nested workflow. I'm going to invoke this workflow in main. And you'll see it here. It'll show up in my project tab here on the top level. I can also put it in folders. A lot of people will organize their workflows by functionality inside of different folders. So if you'd say, I have a bunch of workflows that are hitting, I don't know, Excel and doing things with spreadsheets, I might put those in an Excel folder or something. So that's a nice way to organize your project. I'm just putting it here in the top so that's easy to access. When we drag it over into the main sequence, we pull in what's called an invoke activity. And you'll see we have the workflow file name. So we've got, it's always going to be .xaml. Workflows are a XAML type. They're a XAML file. And then we've got our arguments here. So this workflow doesn't actually have any arguments yet. But the point of this is we're going to show how arguments work on a workflow. And again, just like variables, I'm not going to go into detail on the data manager panel this time, but I will say, actually, there are a few things that I want to show in the data manager panel, so we'll say that we'll show that as well. But arguments show up here in the data manager panel. They also show up over here, and they work the same way as variables, except they don't have a scope, but they have a direction. So I just created two arguments there. This first one is going to be an in argument. I'm going to say in name, right? I can set a default value if I want to. I can give it a type. We're just going to keep that one string. And you'll see that it doesn't have a scope. So our arguments are like, they're almost like a variable that exists at the top level. You can use them anywhere. They're going to be accessible throughout the entire workflow. One thing about this direction is that this direction determines what you're going to be using that argument for. If it's an input to the workflow, so name might be an input, and then let's say I'm going to create a workflow that actually does something here. So you notice I'm always using this in underscore, and then I'm going to create an out argument here called out full name. So I've got these three arguments. Our types, we can use any of the types that we could use with variables as well. But the direction is really what's different here. So with the in arguments, those are coming into the workflow. You can think of this as a function. Name and last name are coming in, and then I'm going to output the full name. So for this first one, I'm just going to set an assign here and show you what this looks like. I can set my full name to be in name plus a space plus in last name, right? So I've got my two input arguments being concatenated into my output argument. One thing you'll notice with the output argument is it does not support a default value, right? So there's no concept of a default value for an output argument. It doesn't really make sense, right? Because this is coming out of the workflow. The workflow has to do something to generate our output argument. So there's no default value, but we can have default values. Like if I was to say Mason and then Turvey, I can have default values for my input arguments. And you'll see those show up when we invoke the workflow itself. And we'll get to that in just a second. I want to show the last type before we get there. There's one more type. It's called an IO or an in-out. I'm just going to name that in-out arg. And we can set that in-out here. You see that last one, property. I honestly don't know what that one does. You can kind of just ignore that. I've never used that one for anything. So in-out does support a default value, so you can treat it like an input, but it's also going to set it on the way out. That's a little bit deceptive, I will say this, because anything that's passed by reference, so anything that isn't like int32 boolean that are your like very base types are going to be changed regardless of whether they're an in or an out variable. They like changing the value changes the value in the other workflow as well. So like if this was a data table and I added a row, regardless of the fact that it's an in argument, it will change on the way out. It doesn't do any duplication. It's actually passing a reference to that variable. So you got to be careful. Just because it's an in argument does not mean that it can't be modified inside the workflow and it will appear different on the other side. So be very careful about that. Being an in out, if you're using like int32, right? int32, if you change it inside here, it's not going to change on the outside one. So if I was to pass an int32 from my main sequence to my nested workflow and change it inside the nested workflow, it'll stay the same in the main sequence, but it'll be changed inside of this. Whereas if I passed, I'm not sure if, I think strings work the same way as ints, but if I pass like a queue item and I added something into the specific data inside of nested workflow, it's going to show up out here as well. So just be careful about that. Anything that you pass by reference is going to be modified within the workflow, regardless of the direction of the variable.
And I think that is an important concept, especially for the base types, because if you've got, you can have it named IO and have the direction listed there. So one, you want to make sure that those are appropriately named, because it's easy to call something or to see something referenced from another procedure, assume that it's a certain type of argument and it's not. Workflow Analyzer also will help validate that. So if you've got something that's a direction in, but it's actually an out or an IO, that type of thing, it'll call that out for you and help you find those, because those will often become bugs later when you expect something to take on a certain value, like an in argument, and you assign it, it'll still let you assign it, but it's not gonna keep the value the way that you'd expect it to.
Yeah. And it's very important to always look at your directions. I will say, like, the number one bug, or not bug, but like the issue that I think, like, if I was to tally up all of the red exclamation points that I've gotten in UiPath, like 95% of them are me not changing this from in to out when I need it to be out. Like, I almost always forget to do that. So that's just something, you'll catch it. Because you'll try to run it and then it'll break and you'll be like, why is this breaking? And it's like, oh, my out last name is set as an in direction. Okay. But that's something that I do all the time.
Well, now we know about the Control-Shift-M keyboard shortcut, so.
Yeah,
I
well,
also
actually,
learned that.
yeah, let's try that one. Let's try that one. I haven't used that one yet. So Control-Shift-M, set argument. Yeah, I created an out argument. That's so cool. Yeah.
That is cool.
That's really handy. Hang on a second. I've got to plug my headset in. It's about to die. Can you guys still hear me?
Yes, we can.
Sweet. All right. So that's arguments in the panel over here, the arguments panel. I'm gonna go over here to the design panel because there's a few other things in here. There's specifically one more thing. There's this is required. This is only really relevant for when you're creating libraries, but you can set an argument to be required by the workflow. So if that argument is required, it either needs a default value or a value passed in. So I could say you can set output, input, and IO to be required by a workflow. So what that'll do is it means you have to set this on the way out for an output. You have to set this on the way in, right? So that's handy. And then this data manager works the same way as it does for variables in all other senses. You can rename, right, by double clicking. You can set your direction here. You can set your data type. All that fun jazz. Okay, so now how do we actually use these arguments? So we've created this workflow. We've set arguments, right? Now what do we do with them? That's where we go back to our workflow that's invoking that workflow, right? And you can see that I now have this, the following arguments are missing or misconfigured, right? So it's recognizing my arguments are there, but they're not here. So I've got to click this little import arguments button. And then I've got 4 items in dictionary here. I can click this to expand it. And now I have my arguments that are coming from my nested workflow that we created. And I'm going to be passing those in or out. So let's say I'm going to give it an in name. I'm going to give it Mason Turvey, just give it my name. We didn't really use the IO, so I'm not going to really pass anything there. And then I'm going to create a variable, Control K, called full name on the way out. This is where things kind of get a little confusing for some people, is like, why are we creating a variable with the same name as this argument? Well, this argument doesn't exist inside of main, right? This exists inside of the nested workflow. I need something to store my data inside of main. So you'll see a lot of this passing variables to arguments and vice versa. Anytime there's an output argument, it's almost always going to go to a variable. I actually can't think of a case where it doesn't go to a variable, because it needs to set it to something that exists by reference. So it's pretty much always going to go to that variable. Inputs, I mean, I can put a string in here, or I could create a different variable and then input it here. And in fact, I'll go ahead and show that. I can create a last name there, and I can set my last name in the default here, right? And pass it in. And I'm actually going to run this one so that we can see it. Debug this file. All right, so now we'll see, I'm going to look over here to the left. You'll see I have this locals. This is where you can actually view your variables and everything. I've got my last name set to Turvey, right? So that's my variable. I can change it here if I wanted to during the run. And then I can step into my nested workflow. It's going to go in here, step into again, and now we're on assign. We can see it passed Mason for name, Turvey for last name. Our full name isn't set yet. That's because that happens in this assign activity, right? Boom. So we've got full name equals Mason Turvey. I'm going to go ahead and step out of that. So now we've got full name, the variable inside of main, being set from our argument, our output argument, right? Here, we'll go ahead and log the message just to kind of complete the loop. So I'm using the variable here. You'll notice I'm not using the argument because the argument doesn't exist in main. I could also log it here inside of nested workflow. And I'm going to say nested workflow plus out full name. And let's just prefix this with main so we can see the difference here. So this time I'm going to step over nested workflow, and we're going to watch down here in the output. You can see that message, nested workflow, Mason Turvey. So that's using the argument, right? And then main, that's using the variable inside of main. You kind of get a feel for how that works over time. A lot of people, at the first time you look at this, it's not super intuitive, but it does kind of make sense after you start creating workflows. Something that's really cool about variables and workflows, variables and arguments, is you can change from a variable to an argument. So if you notice that you've created a variable and you're like, oh, I need that to be an argument, that's an input to this workflow, I can convert it to an argument. After you do that, it'll show up in your arguments tab, right? And you'll have to put your prefix in front of it. I can convert it back to a variable, remove my prefix. You don't want to use that in-out prefix on variables because you want to reserve that only for your arguments. I can also do that. I'm pretty sure we can do that here. Yeah, I can do that in the data manager as well.
And you can actually have two different items called the same thing. You definitely want to avoid doing that.
Yeah, if you actually, can you?
Oh yeah, you can for sure. I've had that bug a number of times.
Oh yeah, so you can.
It causes problems.
So this is where the non-ambiguous naming comes in. Avoid doing this. So I have a variable named DT table, and then I have an argument named DT table. And if we create them as the same data type, now we're in fact, use something.
And yeah, I
data
think that's
table.
why they created those convert utilities, because they didn't used to be there a couple of years ago, because it's a pretty common scenario to need to move it to one or the other, which you have to or used to have to copy and paste the info over to the other panel, and then you forget to remove the other one, and then now you've got two, and you don't know which one it picked up whenever you're running the procedure.
Exactly. Yeah. So I've got DT table in both a variable and an argument now. And I'm using this activity that takes in a data table, right? They're both set to the data table type and they're both named the same thing. Which one is it actually using here is the question, right? It validates and there's no errors going on. I'm pretty sure it defaults to using the argument, but I honestly couldn't say. Just avoid, that's why we prefix arguments within out or IO so that we know that they're arguments when we're using them inside of the designer panel. So if I set this, rename it, it's now renamed here. That's another cool feature. If you rename arguments here in the argument panel or in the variable panel, you can rename variables there. Or if you name them here in the data manager, they will change everywhere inside of your designer panel as well. So that's a handy little tip. That way you don't have to like type it 100 different times. But that can also be, maybe you were intending to use the variable here and it just renamed it to the argument. So that's why we always avoid naming things the same. And really the best way to avoid that is by having your prefix on your variables always. The only time that UiPath recommends not having a prefix on your variables is when you're creating activities in a library that are public activities. And that's like way outside of the scope of this discussion, so we're not going to talk about that. But that is like the only time that they recommend not putting in or out on your variable name or argument names. All right. So I think that covers it for arguments. We'll go back to the PowerPoint, kind of walk through and review again, just like we did with variables. So we've got our arguments panel down there, right? We've got our name, direction, argument type, and default value. So again, in argument can only be used within a given workflow, not project. We're going to say workflow. Out argument can be used to pass data outside a given workflow. In, out, it can go both in and out. I find myself not really using in, outs super often. I normally am really sticking to ins and outs for most of my arguments, but there are use cases for in, out. So a nice little exercise would be demonstrating steps to create and initialize arguments through the arguments panel. Create two different workflows like we did in the walkthrough. Use the first workflow to add two arguments and pass the result to the other workflow. The second workflow will then add the values and return the result. All right. We already talked about arguments versus variables, but we're going to dig into it a little bit more here. So arguments store data and passes it between two different workflows, whereas in variables stores data and passes it between activities, right? So activities being in the scope of sequences being where variables live, arguments kind of live outside of the workflow and are coming in and out. An argument can be used across multiple workflows. Really, it can only be used across two, right? It's going to be the one invoking and the one being invoked. Variables, they are limited to the workflow in which they are defined, right? They're only in that workflow and they can be scoped down into different containers. Arguments, they are created and modified through the arguments panel, and then variables through the variables panel, or both through the data manager. And then arguments are defined by properties, name, direction, type, and default value. And variables, and remember, default value does not apply for the output type argument. And then for variables, it's defined by the properties name, type, scope, and default value. All right. So a little practice exercise. We're recording this, so if you want to pause it and go work on this, that would be a good opportunity to kind of get some experience. Building a workflow that swaps two numbers using a third variable, right? So ask the user to input two numeric values and store them in two variables. So we're going to ask for the user to input those two. We're going to swap the values of both of those variables using a third variable, and then display the initial and swap values of both the variables in the output panel. All right. And for a summary, so we've looked at variables and their types, we've looked at the variables panel, we've looked at the scope of a variable, we've looked at arguments, the arguments panel, the argument directions, and the argument versus variable. Kind of looked at all of these things. Understand that there are some similarities between variables and arguments. You know, they store data. There are different types that they can use to store data. We reference them in the designer panel the same way by typing in their names. We can use them in the properties panel. I didn't show that with arguments, but I did show that with variables. So you can also use your arguments in your properties panel as well. We can define them in their respective panels in the designer, and we can also do that in the data manager. And then the main difference between arguments and variables, variables have a scope because they're within the workflow, and they might be scoped down to different activities. And then arguments are outside of your workflow, so they have a direction in or out of that workflow, right? And then we've got some time. So just to kind of complete the circle, I'm going to pull back to my screen there. That's kind of covers it for arguments and variables, but there's one last panel that shows up, and that's our imports panel down here. This is where we get our different variable and argument types, and I think this is relevant to variables and arguments. So if I was to want to pull in a different type, right? So if I'm looking at my variable types here, my int32s, I've got my data tables and everything. Those come kind of out of the box with UiPath, and for 99% of your cases, or 95, I'll say 95. For 95% of your cases, you're going to be using the variables that are typed and given here, and you can browse for them. But in some cases, maybe you're hitting an API and you need to serialize and deserialize JSON or something that's a little bit more complicated and doesn't come out of the box with UiPath. You can bring in different types using imported namespaces. So for serializing and deserializing, I would use newtonsoft.json, right? And you can see when I type in here, I get all of these different ones like that. So that's how I would bring in new types that can then show up here in my argument types. So one that's specific to Newtonsoft is the J object, right? So now I can see that here. Whereas if I removed that import, that's not going to show up. Now it does. Something else is probably referencing it. But you can add NuGet packages through your package manager, and I'm pretty sure that's going to be covered in a different session. But you can add those NuGet packages, and then you can reference them through the imports here. And then you can bring those types in and start using those. So when we were talking about the queue item earlier, right, this queue item type, you'll see it's in UiPath.core. That's an import here. Those imports are also going to exist in the data manager. They're called namespaces, so they'll show up down here. So if you need to bring in a different type that you need to set a variable or an argument to, you can do it either one of those two ways. So that's the last tab here with the variables and arguments. That's your imports tab, and that kind of is where you bring in different types, and you can use those. All right, I think that pretty much covers it. That is everything that we can say about arguments and variables.
Thank you, Mason. Great job. And I think that's it. So I'm going to stop the recording, and then I just want to talk to you guys for a few minutes.
Mm-hmm.